It wasn't destroyed. It wasn't lost. It was hidden. A gospel once celebrated by early Christians gone, not burned in a Roman purge, not censored in a medieval council. No, it simply slipped into silence. But when it re-emerged, centuries later, buried beneath the Egyptian sands, it spoke in riddles, strange parables, whispers of divine light, and a Christ who didn't die to save, but came to wake the sleeping. The gospel of truth, praised by bishops, banished by canon. What did it say that the Church could never allow into its story? Let that settle. A sacred text that called itself truth, erased. Not because it was false, but because it didn't fit. Take a breath. You won't need to rush. The truth, if it ever lived at all, has waited this long. It can wait a little longer. The desert does not forget. It hoards the things men bury, scrolls, bones, secrets. In 1945, near a place called Nag Hammadi, a clay jar cracked open the ancient silence. Inside were gospels unlike any preached from pulpits. No fire and brimstone, no sinners in need of saving. Instead, there were riddles, fragments of light, a divine mystery that had less to do with punishment and more to do with remembering. Among them lay the gospel of truth, like something overheard in a dream. Fluid, abstract, almost allergic to doctrine. It spoke of a Christ who didn't bleed for guilt, but came to pull us from a fog of forgetfulness. A Christ who saved not through sacrifice, but through knowledge, gnosis. But this gospel didn't stand alone. It had rivals, brothers, enemies, other secret teachings that tried to answer the same question: who really was Jesus? Some saw him as a revealer, some a guide. A few saw him as illusion, and one even as a trickster's pawn. This is a story of those rival gospels, the hidden messages about Christ that once competed for the soul of Christianity. Some survived in whispers, some were crushed under creeds, others, they simply faded into sand. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The story of its unearthing begins not in a cathedral or a seminary, but in a cave, dry, crumbling, almost forgettable. In 1945, in the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer named Muhammad al-Saman stumbled upon a sealed clay jar. Some say he feared it might be cursed. Others say he thought it held a jinn. What it held instead was paper, ancient, brittle, and stained with centuries of dust. 52 texts bound in leather and buried since the 4th century. Among them a riddle in prose, the gospel of truth. Its name is either bold or ironic, depending on how one reads it. No, according to Matthew, no parables of fig trees or bleeding hands. Instead, a dreamscape of metaphors and gentle revelations. A divine being sent to rescue humanity, not from sin, but from error. Not through crucifixion, but by knowledge. The gospel speaks like a memory being slowly remembered, as though the act of reading it is part of a greater awakening. And yet its language is frustratingly elusive. It offers no timeline, no miracle checklist, no enemies to vanquish. It opens with silence. It closes with metaphor. It lacks tension, yet brims with urgency. And in the center, Christ, not the atoning lamb, but the revealer of hidden memory. He is the book and the voice and the message and the messenger. He is everything, and nothing the bishops later canonized. The style suggests Valentinian authorship, or at least influence. Some scholars say it might have been penned by Valentinus himself, though the text is anonymous. That anonymity, ironically, lends it more weight. It doesn't assert its authority, it flows. In this world, authority isn't declared. It's experienced. The reader isn't told what to believe. They're invited to remember. The Church, however, remembered differently. By the time of Irenaeus in the late 2nd century, a strong line was drawn between orthodoxy and heresy. Anything too abstract, too fluid, too open-ended was deemed dangerous. If salvation could come through personal revelation, what need was there for priests, for councils, for Rome? Still, one thing remains undeniable: this gospel was not marginal. It was respected enough to be copied, preserved, and buried for safekeeping. Had it been meaningless, it would not have been hidden. It would have been discarded. The physical manuscript itself tells its own tale. Written in Coptic, translated from an earlier Greek original, its pages are delicate but deliberate. Scholars noticed how carefully the text was copied, suggesting that whoever preserved it valued it deeply, and they should have. For in this single gospel, entire theological assumptions are turned upside down. Gone is the wrathful God demanding blood. In his place is a loving Father, distant only because we forgot him. Gone is sin as moral failing. Instead, there is ignorance, a fog over our minds. And Christ, he doesn't descend to be punished. He descends to remind us who we are. Of course, not everyone reads it this way. Some argue that the text is so poetic as to be meaningless, a stream of consciousness, with the illusion of depth. Others suggest it's more philosophy than scripture, a kind of early Christian meditation manual, rather than a doctrinal text. And still, there are those who insist its vagueness is the point. After all, if truth is divine, wouldn't it resist tidy summaries? Wouldn't it shimmer just beyond language like heat above desert sand? Its rediscovery also reopens old wounds about canon, about control, about which truths were deemed safe and which were buried. The fact that it was excluded from the official New Testament isn't surprising. What's surprising is how different it is from those texts that made the cut. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus walks and speaks and bleeds. He touches lepers. He flips tables. He dies and rises. In the gospel of truth, he feels like mist and memory. You don't see him. You remember him. You don't follow him. You awaken to him. But how did such a radically different portrayal coexist with the early church's message? How was this text even tolerated in its time? The answer lies not just in theology, but in power. In the 2nd century, the borders of Christian thought were still being drawn in sand. Gnostic texts, Valentinian letters, and speculative gospels circulated freely before orthodoxy hardened into granite. Yet even before the creeds came, the tension was there. Between the mystical and the institutional, between knowing and believing, between remembering and obeying. In this tension, the gospel of truth hovered, whispered, copied, and eventually concealed. It waited, not to shout, but to be rediscovered by those still listening. And when it finally emerged from its dusty tomb, blinking in the modern sun, it asked a quiet, defiant question. What if the Christ you remember isn't the one they taught you to believe in? You can almost hear him somewhere between Alexandria and Rome, pen in hand, dust on his robe, scribbling thoughts that balanced on the edge of orthodoxy. Valentinus. A name now whispered with suspicion, but once spoken with reverence. He wasn't a fringe figure preaching from caves or hiding from bishops. At one point, he nearly became Bishop of Rome. Yes, that Rome. The Rome. Valentinus lived in the 2nd century, likely born in Egypt, educated in Alexandria's philosophical melting pot. He absorbed Platonic thought, blended it with early Christian teachings, and crafted something exquisitely complex, almost too complex. His was a theology that spoke in spirals, God as unknowable fullness, Christ as a cosmic messenger. Salvation not through blood, but through awakening. The gospel of truth, many argue, flows directly from his vision. What makes Valentinus so confounding is how close he came to shaping the mainstream. He wasn't an outsider throwing stones at the cathedral. He was standing inside drawing frescoes on its walls before they were finished. For years, his followers called Valentinians coexisted within the early church. They baptized, they preached, they debated. And their version of Christ, while mystical, wasn't necessarily seen as heretical at first. Valentinus taught that the world was born of a cosmic error. A divine being named Sophia, the embodiment of wisdom, had tried to grasp the unknowable Father, and in doing so, birthed the flawed creator of our material world. This being often referred to as the demiurge thought himself God, but was ignorant. Into this broken cosmos came Christ, not to offer atonement through death, but to awaken those whose souls still carried sparks of divine memory. This was no small tweak. This was a spiritual revolution. It reframed everything: the purpose of Jesus, the meaning of salvation, the identity of God. And yet it was taught with calm authority, not rebellion. Valentinus didn't storm the gates. He knocked politely, almost academically. Church fathers, especially Irenaeus, saw the danger. Not because Valentinus was a lunatic, but because he was persuasive. His teachings weren't wild-eyed ramblings. They were structured, poetic, and often beautiful. Worse, he quoted scripture fluently. He didn't discard the Gospels, he reinterpreted them. In fact, that's part of the ongoing debate: was Valentinus a corrupter of Christian truth, or one of its earliest interpreters? Before the creeds calcified, the Church eventually chose the former. And yet scholars today continue to wrestle with the possibility that he simply represented an alternative path, a fork in the theological road, that was bricked over by power, not disproved by truth. Even among modern theologians, Valentinus provokes unease. His system is intellectually seductive but spiritually elusive. It doesn't offer the comfort of a God who forgives. It offers instead the challenge of a God who must be remembered, not through ritual, through revelation. And that brings us back to the gospel of truth. Its lyrical style, its circular logic, its fixation on memory and knowledge, all of it echoes Valentinian thought. Though the text itself never names its author, its DNA speaks his name over and over. It doesn't explain salvation. It draws you toward it as if with a magnet made of metaphor. It's tempting to imagine what might have been. If Valentinus had become Bishop of Rome, would the Church today meditate rather than confess? Would sermons sound more like poetry than proclamation? Would cathedrals be quiet temples of remembrance instead of fortresses of belief? Of course, there's a reason his ideas met resistance. The simplicity of the Christian message, faith, forgiveness, redemption, had power in its clarity. Valentinian theology required initiation, study, contemplation. It favored the few. That exclusivity was both its strength and its undoing. It didn't scale well. But oh, was it alluring. And then there's the obscure detail that refuses to fade. Valentinus claimed he received his knowledge not from study, but from a direct chain. Judas, a disciple of Paul, had passed on a secret teaching. The implication that the mystical Christ, the revealer of inner truth, wasn't a Gnostic innovation, but part of the apostolic tradition itself. That alone has kept scholars debating for decades. Others remain skeptical. They argue that Valentinus was no apostle in hiding, but a spiritual philosopher adapting Christianity to suit Platonic appetites. His ideas, they say, were too abstract, too detached from the gritty urgency of a world hungry for forgiveness, not riddles. Still, there is something profoundly moving in his attempt to see salvation not as a courtroom verdict, but as a light slowly dawning. To imagine Jesus not as a transaction, but a mirror, a revealer, a memory. And isn't that what the gospel of truth whispers from its pages? Not a command to believe, but an invitation to remember. It's as if Valentinus wasn't just writing theology. He was leaving breadcrumbs, not for the church, for you. In the pages of the Gospel of Truth, Jesus does not bleed. He doesn't groan under the weight of the cross. He does not cry out, "Why have you forsaken me?" That version, the suffering Redeemer crucified for sin, is absent. Instead, there is a different kind of Christ, one who speaks in echoes, who comes not to die, but to stir memory, to awaken something you forgot you had, something ancient and divine. This was not a casual rebranding. It was a theological rupture. The Christ of this gospel is less man, more mirror. He doesn't save you by substitution, but by recognition. In this telling, the problem with the world isn't sin. It's ignorance, not guilt, forgetfulness. You haven't disobeyed God. You've simply lost your way in a world made by mistake. And Jesus, rather than dying to appease a wrathful Father, enters that world to remind you of your true origin. It's a beautiful heresy if you like poetry with your apocalypse. The narrative arc of Christian salvation, creation, fall, redemption gets twisted into something more circular. You weren't born broken. You were born asleep, and Christ doesn't pay a price. He sounds an alarm, but this too comes with complications. Because if Jesus is primarily a revealer, then the burden shifts. It's no longer enough to believe. You must awaken. You must understand. You must remember. Faith becomes cognition. Grace becomes gnosis. In Orthodox theology, this borders on scandal. It undermines the entire machinery of priesthood and sacrament. If salvation is a quiet realization, rather than a blood-soaked transaction, what's the point of confession, of penance, of dogma? And so a new polarity emerged in early Christianity. On one side, the Christ of blood and forgiveness, the Redeemer who suffered to pay our debts. On the other, the Christ of light and memory, the Revealer who pulls us from the fog. These weren't just stylistic differences. They were two blueprints for what it meant to be saved. Of course, the version that emphasized institutional authority had more staying power. A crucified Christ demanded loyalty, obedience, gratitude. A revealer Christ, well, he just needed you to wake up. The Gospel of Truth leans hard into this second vision. Jesus is described as the Word, the book, the knowledge, and the path. He is not the lamb on the altar. He is the guide leading you out of a maze you didn't know you were in. And intriguingly, he doesn't seem angry. There is no wrath here, no threats, no final judgment, only longing, a cosmic yearning for reunion. That tone is part of what makes this gospel so haunting. It's not apocalyptic, it's elegiac. There's no end times fire. Just a soft call to remember something you once knew before the world taught you to forget. This Christ doesn't demand your fear. He invites your recollection. It's no surprise that the church found this unsettling. If Jesus didn't need to die, then centuries of theology crumbled. Without the cross, what is the Eucharist? Without sin, what is salvation? And yet this idea of Christ as revealer wasn't limited to the Gospel of Truth. It appears subtly in the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus says, "He who drinks from my mouth will become as I am. I shall become he." That's not substitution. That's identity. The idea also recurs in Valentinian writings that Christ descended not to die for you, but to show you. And what he shows is not his power, but yours. That divine light you carry. That echo of the pleroma, the fullness from which you came. This was not a comfortable gospel. It didn't wrap suffering in redemptive logic. It questioned whether suffering was ever necessary at all. And that brings us to the historical pivot, The shift from Christ the Revealer to Christ the Redeemer wasn't just theological, it was political. A religion centered on knowledge, on inner awakening, is hard to control, but one centered on sin and forgiveness that builds cathedrals. Still, not all scholars agree on how to read the gospel of truth. Some argue that it doesn't so much deny the crucifixion as reframe it less as a sacrifice and more as a cosmic signal. Others say it simply bypasses the crucifixion entirely, placing all the emphasis on incarnation and revelation. The debate continues. And perhaps that's the point. The gospel's language is deliberately slippery. Christ is the Word, but not just any word. He's the name forgotten by those who wandered. He is what you lost when the world began. The reader is never scolded, only invited. You're not unworthy. You're simply amnesiac. That's why in this gospel the greatest evil is not disobedience, but forgetfulness. And the greatest good is not obedience, but recognition. You are not fallen. You are fogged. And Christ comes not to rescue, but to remind, which raises a quiet, lingering question, one that Orthodox Christianity has never quite managed to silence. If you already carry the divine spark, then who exactly is saving whom? It begins not with a birth or a baptism, but with a sentence. These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. No prologue, no miracle, no crucifixion, just sayings like cryptic pearls cast into deep water. The Gospel of Thomas doesn't tell a story. It whispers puzzles. Some sound familiar. Others feel like riddles meant to unlock something buried deep inside you. This gospel, like the gospel of truth, was found in the same discovery at Nag Hammadi. But unlike truth, Thomas claims a direct lineage. Not a mystical voice or poetic metaphor, but Jesus himself speaking plainly. Or not so plainly, depending on who's reading. There are 114 logia sayings, each standing on its own, like a line of code. You don't read Thomas. You meditate on it. Many of the sayings echo the canonical Gospels, but then it twists. Jesus says, "Split a piece of wood, and I am there." He says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." He says, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." No mention of crucifixion, no emphasis on sin. Instead, salvation is internal, interpretive, cryptic, a puzzle of perception. This is where Thomas becomes dangerous, not because it disagrees with orthodoxy, but because it almost does. It stands close enough to the edges of the familiar gospel portrait to feel trustworthy, then slips sideways. This Christ is not a sacrifice. He's a mirror. He's not dying for your sins. He's daring you to remember. That's what makes the Gospel of Thomas a twin threat to the Gospel of Truth. Where truth dances in abstraction, Thomas sits calmly in your lap and tells you something that seems simple until it isn't. One invites you to awaken through poetry, the other through paradox. And here's the historical friction: there's growing scholarly debate about whether Thomas might predate the canonical Gospels. That's the open question that won't go away. Some researchers argue it preserves early independent traditions of Jesus' sayings, oral fragments, that circulated before the stories of virgin births and empty tombs solidified. If true, that would mean the mystical Christ was not a later invention, but the original message. Not an evolution, a foundation. Other scholars, however, reject this entirely. They argue that Thomas reflects a later Gnostic reinterpretation, cherry-picking Jesus' words and bending them into a system of private revelation. That Thomas was written by communities disillusioned with the direction of mainstream Christianity and determined to pull Christ back into mystery. But whether early or late, the effect is the same. Thomas reads like a test. It's not telling you what happened. It's asking you to figure out what matters. And then there's the name Didymos Judas Thomas, the twin. This strange doubling has inspired centuries of speculation. Was Thomas Jesus's twin brother? Was he a symbolic twin, a stand-in for all of us, mirrors of the divine? Or was this merely a literary device, a way to confer authority on a gospel that refused to play by the rules? The twin motif echoes something from the gospel of truth, the idea that the soul has forgotten its origin, that we are estranged from ourselves. Perhaps Thomas the twin exists to reflect what we've become versus what we once were. And what about the image of Jesus in Thomas? He doesn't preach to crowds. He doesn't heal lepers. He doesn't cast out demons. He speaks quietly, privately, as if the whole world has already happened, and now he's waiting for you to catch up. In saying 70, he says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." That's not a priest's instruction. That's a koan. It assumes you have something hidden inside worth discovering. It assumes Christ's job is not to give you something new, but to help you remember something old. And once again, we find ourselves back in the uncomfortable realm of revelation versus redemption. In Orthodoxy, Jesus dies to fix what you broke. In Thomas and in truth, he simply reminds you that you're not broken, just blind. This threatens the entire scaffolding of institutional faith. Because if salvation is internal, what becomes of ritual? If divinity is discovered, what becomes of doctrine? The Gospel of Thomas offers no Eucharist, no crucifixion, no resurrection narrative. Its Christ is alive and speaking, but not explaining. He challenges, he warns, he even mocks at times with that quiet smile the canonical Gospels tried to soften. And somewhere in that tension, the echo of the gospel of truth grows louder. Both texts assume something has been forgotten. Both assume Jesus came not to die but to remind, and both whisper that the way back is not through rules, but through reflection. Which might explain why Thomas, like truth, was hidden, preserved in jars, not to destroy, but to wait. For someone willing to read not just with the eyes, but with the memory. Because this gospel does not say believe, it says interpret, and if the words save you, it's because they were already yours. She falls not from grace, but from knowing too much. Sophia Wisdom herself becomes the most enigmatic figure in the cosmologies that orbit the gospel of truth. She is not an apostle nor an angel. She is not a villain, yet she is blamed. In the tangled metaphysics of Valentinian thought and its gospel offspring, Sophia becomes the moment where perfection bends and forgets. The gospel of truth never names her directly, but her fingerprints are everywhere in the metaphors of error, in the theme of forgetfulness, in the story of a world created by mistake. This isn't Genesis with its obedient light and six-day rhythm. This is the pleroma, the realm of fullness, where divine beings emanate in pairs, until Sophia acts alone. Her name, Greek for wisdom, carries weight in both Jewish and Hellenistic traditions. In Proverbs, she stands beside God, rejoicing at creation. In later Jewish mysticism, she's the shimmering radiance of divine presence, almost a bridge between the infinite and the tangible. But in Valentinian myth, she crosses a line. She tries to know the unknowable Father. She reaches too far, tries to grasp too much. And in that moment of desire, the cosmos fractures. From her fall, or rather her fragmentation, comes the demiurge, the blind creator of the material world. Not evil, but ignorant. A god who thinks he is God. A craftsman without the blueprint. And this world, it is his flawed architecture. Beautiful, yes, but incomplete. Off-key. Sophia becomes the tragic heroine of Gnostic myth. She doesn't rebel, she forgets. And that act of forgetting of separation from the fullness is what mirrors the human condition. We too are wanderers from our origin. We too are trapped in a world of echoes. We too need reminding, and so Christ enters. Not to avenge Sophia, but to complete her. To gather what she scattered. To speak the name she lost. In some Gnostic texts, including the Gospel of Philip, Sophia's restoration parallels humanity's. As she is rescued, so are we. In this theology, salvation isn't a one-time event. It's a cosmic mending. The Church predictably had no patience for this mythic ballet. Sophia was too slippery, too feminine, too central. The idea of a divine feminine principle predating the world, giving accidental birth to its flawed creator and requiring a male redeemer to rescue her, it was all a little too much. Too messy, too poetic, too uncontrollable. But she wouldn't go away. And here's the obscure detail scholars often debate in some versions of the myth: Sophia never actually fell. She simply emanated a shadow. And it was that shadow, her unformed longing, that created the error. In this reading, Sophia remains luminous, untouched, a symbol of divine yearning rather than divine failure. Others, however, insist that her fall is real and necessary, that without the fall there is no need for Christ, no need for memory, no need for this strange universe where we learn by losing ourselves. It all hinges on one question: is wisdom dangerous? The canonical tradition tends to keep wisdom safely abstract. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of it. It is a gift, a blessing, a trait of good kings and cautious prophets. But in the Valentinian and Gnostic traditions, wisdom becomes volatile. It acts, it chooses, it overreaches, it dares to know. This interpretation reintroduces a feminine divine presence that mainstream Christianity tried hard to forget. Mary may be venerated, but she is silent. Eve is remembered for disobedience, not desire. But Sophia moves. Sophia disrupts. And the gospel of truth, without naming her, leans into her story. The entire narrative framework hinges on an initial forgetting, a fracture in the divine harmony. Humanity is caught in that fracture. Our ignorance is not guilt, it is inheritance. And Christ, far from being a sacrifice for sin, becomes a healer of memory. He does not undo the fall. He completes the story. Some modern theologians have tried to rehabilitate Sophia, casting her as a symbol of divine creativity or the personification of the soul's longing for God. Others see her as a cipher for something older, still a memory of goddess worship, suppressed but not extinguished. But the debate continues unresolved, like everything in these lost Gospels. Was Sophia the real Eve, the one who reached for knowledge not out of pride, but out of hunger for the divine? And if so, was she right to fall? The gospel of truth does not answer. It only mourns the error and sings of its correction. Which brings us full circle. If Christ came to heal what Sophia fractured, then she is not the villain of the story. She is the beginning, the first tremor in the divine stillness, the cause of the melody and the reason we remember the tune. And maybe that's the secret. Maybe Christ is not the rescuer of a broken world, but the echo of Sophia's original question. Can I know the unknowable? The trouble with ideas is that they multiply. A single gospel may be manageable, a few bishops debating containable. But dozens of rival visions of Christ, some mystical, some metaphorical, some dismissing sin entirely, now that's a threat. By the end of the 2nd century, the early church was less a house of prayer and more a theological battlefield. Enter Irenaeus of Lyon, bishop, polemicist, and hammer of heresies. His seminal work against heresies reads like a scorched earth campaign. Page after page, he catalogues the teachings of the Valentinians, the Gnostics, the Marcionites, and tears them down with righteous fire. He wasn't subtle. He wasn't poetic. He was building a wall. And the gospel of truth, it was outside that wall. For Irenaeus, the danger wasn't just theological, it was existential. If Christ could be anything, then the church could be nothing. Valentinus, with his poetic metaphysics and layered cosmology, was painted as a corrupter of faith. His gospel was not wisdom. It was deception, wrapped in sweetness, like honey over poison. The metaphors of the gospel of truth, its language of error and forgetfulness, were interpreted as cunning traps for the spiritually naive. And yet there's irony here. Irenaeus actually knew some of these gospels. He had read them. He quoted them. He even acknowledged that some Christians found them inspiring. His goal wasn't to erase their memory. It was to render them inert, to label them as danger rather than doctrine. That required a shift in strategy, the creation of a canon. Before Irenaeus, there was no fixed list of New Testament texts. Communities had letters, stories, hymns. Some read Mark, others favored Matthew. Paul's writings floated from hand to hand. It was fluid. But fluidity is vulnerability. So Irenaeus, with increasing urgency, began to shape boundaries. 4 Gospels, not 50. 1 Christ, not 10. A Redeemer, not a Revealer. The gospel of truth, with its circular logic and lack of crucifixion, had no place in this new architecture. Its Christ didn't bleed. Its salvation didn't require obedience. Its theology was too elegant, too slippery. And perhaps worst of all, it offered the reader agency. You didn't receive truth. You remembered it. Dangerous stuff. That was the core problem. A gospel that taught you to look inward to find divinity through memory and recognition could bypass the church entirely. No priest, no sacrament, no hierarchy. Just the self-awakening. For a movement trying to consolidate power that was unacceptable. And so began the clampdown. Texts like the Gospel of Truth weren't just denounced. They were hidden, burned, buried. Ownership became dangerous. Even possessing a copy of such a gospel could lead to excommunication, or worse. The term heretic evolved from a label of deviation to a sentence of doom. This wasn't simply about protecting doctrine, it was about control. If the church could define which Christ was real, then it could shape empires. Emperors might listen. Councils could be summoned. Orthodoxy could be enforced not just spiritually, but politically. That required clarity, not nuance. Simplicity, not metaphor. The Gnostic Gospels, with their riddles and silences, threatened to blur the lines too much. And yet they persisted, copied in secret, shared in whispers, preserved in deserts. That's the obscure detail that scholars often emphasize despite the ferocity of the Orthodox response. The Gnostic and Valentinian texts were never fully erased. They simply went underground. Why? Because they answered questions the canon refused to ask. Why does suffering exist? Why does God feel so distant? Why does truth seem to shimmer always just out of reach? The canonical Gospels gave reassurance. The rival texts gave mystery. And for some, that mystery felt truer. Modern scholars still argue over the motives behind the early church's suppression. Was it fear of chaos, a sincere conviction of truth? Or was it the natural instinct of institutions to define themselves by exclusion, perhaps all of the above? What's certain is this: the gospel of truth and its siblings were not lost by accident. They were erased with intention. And that act of erasure tells us as much about the early church as the Gospels themselves do about Christ. Even the language of suppression shifted. The term Gnostic became a catch-all slur, a dustbin for anything too mystical, too speculative, too hard to regulate. It didn't matter that many of these groups had little in common. What mattered was that they didn't align. But here's the callback that matters. Remember Sophia. Her fall was not rebellion, but longing. An error born of desire. In a strange parallel, the Orthodox campaign against Gnostic texts was also a response to longing for clarity, for control, for certainty. In both cases, the attempt to grasp the infinite led to division. In both, something precious was scattered. And so the gospel of truth was silenced, not because it was meaningless, but because it meant too much to the wrong people. There's more than one way to imagine a savior. And in the earliest centuries of Christianity, believers did exactly that. The man called Jesus, once a wandering teacher, then a risen Lord, was being pulled in multiple directions. To some, he was a divine spark wrapped in flesh. To others, a prophet elevated by God. To a few, he was barely human at all. The theological seams had not yet hardened, and within those gaps, countless Christologies bloomed like wildflowers, or weeds, depending on who you asked. The gospel of truth fits into this tangled garden. Its Christ is luminous abstract, never quite pinned down. He speaks, but rarely acts. He reveals, but does not suffer. He is more presence than person. You don't picture him eating fish on a beach. You feel him rising within your mind like the sudden memory of a forgotten dream. This Christ doesn't bleed. He breathes truth into error and dissolves it. Compare that to the synoptic Gospels, where Christ's humanity is front and center. He gets hungry. He weeps. He's tempted. In John's Gospel, the divinity sharpens. In the beginning was the Word, but the Word still becomes flesh, still walks, still dies. In the Gospel of Truth, divinity isn't incarnated so much as reflected. The emphasis shifts from historical event to cosmic drama. Jesus is not a chronological person. He is an eternal pattern. He doesn't simply live, he discloses. That distinction matters, because it opens the door to a flurry of alternative interpretations, each one whispering a different answer to the question, who exactly was Jesus? Take the text known as the Second Treatise of the Great Seth, another Nag Hammadi find. It presents a Jesus who laughs at the crucifixion because it wasn't really him on the cross. Someone else, Simon of Cyrene, perhaps was mistaken for him. The real Christ hovered above the chaos, untouched, unkilled. To Orthodox ears, this was blasphemy, but in certain circles, it was liberation. A divine being shouldn't suffer. That's what made him divine. The suffering belonged to the material world, a tragic misunderstanding brought on by ignorance. Then there's the Gospel of the Egyptians, where Christ becomes less a man and more a metaphysical principle, speaking in riddles about aeons and silence and the triple-powered Father. Here Jesus isn't even the center. He's the voice that leads toward something deeper. And in Valentinian thought, the distinctions become even more delicate. There is the earthly Jesus, and then the celestial Christ. They meet. They momentarily merge, and then at the moment of betrayal, they separate again. The human body dies. The divine essence ascends. Two roles, one stage. It's no wonder the early church pushed back so hard. These teachings fractured unity. They made Jesus less accessible, less stable. If the Savior could be whatever the reader perceived, then doctrine had no anchor. The church needed one Christ, not a kaleidoscope of Christs. But here's where it gets tricky. Even within the canon, whispers of ambiguity remain. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus is secretive, cryptic. He tells people not to speak of his miracles. In John, he is transcendent, speaking in riddles about being lifted up, about being one with the Father. There are seeds of mystery, even in orthodoxy seeds the Gnostics were all too happy to water. This open question, what kind of being was Jesus, still pulses in modern scholarship. Was he a healer whose followers mythologized him, a Jewish mystic misinterpreted by Greeks, a divine figure shaped by Hellenistic philosophies, or was he something more elusive, a mirror reflecting whatever the soul dared to see? The gospel of truth doesn't define. It evokes. Its Christ is not an object of belief, but an invitation to insight. He doesn't ask for worship. He calls for awakening. And this awakening is described not as enlightenment in the Eastern sense, but as reconnection, a return to the Father through the recognition of the Son. And yet this lack of definition creates theological unease. Because if Christ cannot be defined, he cannot be confined. He slips past councils, creeds, and confessions. He becomes a living idea, dangerous because ideas can't be nailed to wood. Still, the pattern remains. Christ as revealer, Christ as twin, Christ as echo, and now Christ as silence breaking into form. Call back, if you will, to the figure of Sophia. Her longing for the Father births the demiurge. Her mistake births the material. Christ descends into this error not to destroy it, but to illuminate it. Not to conquer sin, but to untangle misunderstanding. Not to fix creation, but to complete the metaphor. Each alternative Christology weaves into this larger motif that the divine is not far but forgotten. That Jesus is not an interruption, but a reminder. And that salvation comes not through sacrifice, but through seeing clearly what has always been true. That's the thread that ties them together, the gospel of truth, Thomas Philip, Egyptian Seth. They all present Christ not as a singular figure in time, but as a presence already within you, which for some is terrifying. Because if Christ is in you, then you must look. At the heart of many rival gospels lurks a peculiar figure, not a demon, not Satan, but something far more unsettling, a God who thinks he is God. This being called the demiurge is the architect of the material world. He creates stars, animals, rivers, bodies, and he is blind. Not malevolent necessarily, but mistaken, ignorant, arrogant, and above all unaware that he is not the source of all things. The gospel of truth never names him directly, but his shadow lies heavy across its verses. The text speaks of error, forgetfulness, a world cut off from its divine origin. These aren't just poetic gestures, they're code. Code for a universe constructed by a lesser being, a craftsman, without the blueprint. The gospel doesn't scream this. It hums it like a background frequency for those attuned to hear. The concept of the demiurge wasn't born in Christianity. It can be traced back to Plato's Timaeus, where a divine craftsman fashions the world using pre-existing matter. But the Valentinians took this figure and flipped him on his head. Instead of benevolent, he became flawed. Instead of wise, ignorant. And from that reinterpretation, a new theology was born, one in which the material world was not fallen by sin, but broken from inception. And here's the uncomfortable implication. If the Creator is flawed, then the world is not inherently trustworthy. Beauty becomes suspect, authority questionable. Even Scripture itself, if inspired by the demiurge, becomes a potential trap. Suddenly, what you see, touch, obey, all of it might be counterfeit. Not evil, but error. The Orthodox Church unsurprisingly rejected this outright. There could be no God but God. To suggest otherwise wasn't just heresy, it was treason against the very fabric of faith. The Creator of heaven and earth, they insisted, was good. His creation, though marred by sin, was still divine in origin. But in the Valentinian view, sin isn't the problem. Ignorance is. And that ignorance began with the demiurge's mistaken identity. One obscure detail often overlooked is that some versions of the demiurge don't portray him as monstrous. In certain Gnostic texts, he is almost tragic, trying his best unaware of the fullness above him. He's not Lucifer rebelling out of pride. He's a child building sandcastles, thinking he's making empires. And humanity, we are the citizens of his sand. Christ then becomes not a messenger from God to man, but from God to God. He descends not only to awaken us, but to remind the demiurge himself of his limits. In some versions of the myth, Christ even forgives him. That's how deep the compassion goes in these systems. Not even the false creator is beyond redemption. The gospel of truth couches this in metaphor. It speaks of those who act without knowledge of structures built on forgetting. It describes error as a fugitive, not a villain. The tone is not rage, it is sorrow. And that sadness runs deep. A divine realm fractured. A world made by mistake. Souls trapped in a story that forgot its beginning. Of course, this idea complicates everything. If the creator of this world is not the true source, then what becomes of laws, of hierarchies, of sacred institutions? What becomes of Rome, of bishops, of altars, all become suspect. Because they operate within the demiurgic domain. That's why this idea had to be buried, because it doesn't just critique the world. It undermines the system. It casts doubt not on sinners, but on saints, not on rebels, but on rule-makers. And here lies the callback, subtle but deliberate. The gospel of truth speaks of a Christ who comes to awaken those whose names he knew before the foundation. That phrase, before the foundation, is a direct challenge to the idea that this world is the starting point. It implies a deeper reality. One that existed before matter, before flesh, before the demiurge laid his bricks. Scholars continued to debate whether the demiurge was meant to be taken literally or as a symbol of spiritual ignorance. Some argue he represents the ego, the self that believes it is the center of all things. Others suggest he was a veiled critique of imperial authority, a cosmic analogy for emperors who claimed divine status. Either way, his presence redefines everything. Suddenly, salvation isn't being saved from sin. It's being released from illusion. The veil isn't torn, it's lifted. And in that lifting, Christ doesn't defeat a devil. He clarifies a mistake. He doesn't conquer the demiurge. He corrects him. It's a gentler gospel than fire and brimstone, but no less revolutionary. Because if God is not God, then who has the right to speak for him? What happens when the cross is removed from the center of the story, when blood is no longer the price of salvation, but a misreading of the message? The gospel of truth does just that. It does not deny the crucifixion, but it strips it of necessity. There is no theology of atonement here. No divine wrath to be satisfied. No ledger of sins demanding a payment in flesh. Instead, there is only one crisis humanity has forgotten, and one solution Christ has remembered. This is perhaps the most subversive idea in the entire text. Because if Jesus did not come to die as a sacrifice, then the cornerstone of orthodoxy, substitutionary atonement, becomes a misinterpretation. In the gospel of truth, the cross is a tragic event, not a cosmic transaction. It is not central. It is incidental. Christ's death is not the climax of God's redemptive plan. It is the final act of human error, crucifying the very presence of truth, misunderstanding it once again. Instead of lifting up the crucifixion, this gospel leans into its absurdity. Truth enters the world, and the world cannot bear it. Not because it is wicked, but because it is blind. The world lashes out in ignorance, not hatred. It kills what it cannot comprehend. There is no condemnation in this vision, only sorrow. This reversal undermines much more than theological jargon. It shifts the emotional core of Christianity. The canonical Gospels present Jesus as the willing lamb, the fulfillment of divine justice. The Gospel of Truth presents him as a divine whisper misheard and tragically silenced, not because it had to be that way, but because that's what forgetting does. It turns revelation into threat. It turns healers into criminals. It turns memory into myth. And that's where the danger lies for the church, that is. Because if Christ's death was not required, then so many rituals lose their spine. Communion becomes a metaphor, confession a rehearsal, priestly absolution unnecessary. The entire infrastructure of Christian sacramentalism begins to sway. The early church understood this threat. That's why the doctrine of atonement hardened so quickly. The idea that Jesus died for your sins is clean, powerful, easy to preach. It simplifies salvation into a transaction, guilt, payment, forgiveness. It centralizes authority in those who administer that transaction, priests, bishops, councils. But the gospel of truth whispers a different story, one where the divine did not demand suffering, but grieved its inevitability, where truth was not bought, but buried, and where the real resurrection happens not in a tomb, but in your mind when you remember who you were before the world misnamed you. Some scholars have tried to reconcile this view with orthodoxy, suggesting the gospel uses metaphor to describe the same truths in more mystical terms. But the tension remains. The text doesn't speak of a debt paid. It speaks of a father seeking reunion, not justice, restoration. And that leads to one of the most obscure yet revealing details in the gospel. It describes error as a fugitive, not a rebel, not a villain. A fugitive, something that flees from truth not because it's wicked, but because it's confused. That's the posture of the whole text. Gentle correction, cosmic compassion. Christ as the finder, not the punisher. This echoes Valentinian theology, which saw the material world not as evil, but as incomplete, a half-finished symphony. Christ's role was not to burn it down, but to finish the song. Yet for that very reason, the idea of a non-sacrificial Christ was too dangerous to tolerate. It suggested a God who did not demand blood, a faith that did not require priests, a kingdom that did not need swords or martyrs. The callback is quiet but clear. If Sophia's mistake birthed the material world and the demiurge shaped it blindly, then the crucifixion wasn't a divine plan, it was the final ripple of that first forgetting. A world confused about its origin, reacting violently to the messenger of remembrance. And this is where the gospel of truth parts ways with Paul. The apostles' letters are soaked in sacrificial imagery, Christ as the new Passover lamb, the final offering. But here Christ is not an offering, he's an invitation. He doesn't bleed to save you, he speaks to awaken you. Which begs the uncomfortable question, was the crucifixion even necessary? Or was it simply inevitable in a world ruled by error? The answer the text implies is both. It happened because we could not yet understand. But once we do, once we truly remember, there is no more need for death. Not his, not ours. And in that realization lies the gospel's gentle heresy. Not that sacrifice was evil, but that it was never required. Imagine Christianity as a sprawling cathedral in progress, arches, rising saints, carved incense rising, and now picture someone walking in with a chisel calmly removing half the stones. That was Marcion. In the mid-2nd century, he looked at the emerging Christian faith and decided it was bloated, confused, self-contradictory. So he did what no one had yet dared. He created the first Christian canon, just not the one the church wanted. Marcion's theology was as stark as a desert. Two gods. One, the harsh creator of the Hebrew Bible, the God of justice, wrath, and punishment. The other, the Father of Jesus Christ, unknown, invisible, and full of mercy. These were not different moods of the same being. They were different beings entirely. For Marcion, the God of Jesus had no connection to the God who drowned the world, ordered massacres, and demanded burnt offerings. That was a lesser God, a God of law, not love. And so Marcion cut. He rejected the Old Testament in its entirety. He retained only 10 of Paul's letters and a modified version of Luke's Gospel stripped of any Jewish elements. No genealogies, no fulfillment of prophecy, no mention of the law. Just the words and actions of a Christ who appears, teaches, dies, and ascends, no strings attached. The gospel of truth and Marcion's gospel are not the same. One sings in metaphor, the other cuts with clarity. But their Christologies intersect in a provocative way. Both reject the necessity of the crucifixion as payment. Both see the material world as flawed. Both envision salvation not as legal transaction, but as rescue from a broken system. Marcion's Jesus is not the Word made flesh in a Hebrew context. He is a stranger from another realm, a clean break from the world's maker. He doesn't come to fulfill the law. He comes to abolish it, to liberate humanity from a tyrant masquerading as God. This was not a metaphor. Marcion was terrifyingly literal, and that's what made him such a threat. The church responded with ferocity. Tertullian called him the Pontic mouse who gnaws at the scriptures. He was excommunicated, his teachings condemned. But the damage was done. In trying to purge what he saw as contradictions, Marcion forced the church to confront them. And in reacting to his sharp dualism, orthodoxy began to take shape. One obscure but telling detail, it was Marcion's edited canon that first inspired the church to define its own. Before him, there was no fixed list. After him, lists began to appear, lists that included the Old Testament, multiple Gospels, and letters that clearly refuted his theology. In this way, Marcion helped build the church by attacking it. So where does the gospel of truth fit into this picture? It doesn't share Marcion's aggression, but it does share his intuition that the God revealed by Jesus is not the same as the one people had long imagined. The gospel of truth speaks of a Father unknown, not because he hid, but because we forgot. It doesn't depict a tyrant, but it echoes the idea that the creator of this world is not the fullness. There's something deeper, softer, older. And here lies the callback, subtle but unmistakable. The demiurge in Valentinian thought bears a striking resemblance to Marcion's creator God. Both are limited, unaware, inferior to the true Father. Both rule over a material world that misleads. And both must be bypassed if salvation is to occur. But where Marcion uses theology like a sword, Valentinianism, and the gospel of truth prefers a lantern, it doesn't attack, it illuminates. It doesn't denounce the law, it steps around it. Not with anger, but with grace. Modern scholars still debate whether Marcion's dualism was born from philosophical conviction or sheer revulsion. Was he reacting to suffering in the world, trying to make sense of divine cruelty? Or was he offering an alternative spirituality, one in which love did not need wrath to be real? Either way, his influence lingers. Every time a modern Christian winces at the God of Joshua, but embraces the Sermon on the Mount, they echo Marcion. Every time someone reads Jesus as a contradiction to the Old Testament, his ghost flickers in the pews. And yet while Marcion's gospel was rejected, the Church quietly absorbed his challenge. The doctrine of the Trinity emerged in part to reconcile the difference between Jesus and the God of Israel. The inclusion of 4 Gospels helped balance perspective. Even Paul Marcion's favorite was reread through a more unified lens. Still, the Gospel of Truth remains gentler in its divergence. It doesn't pit gods against each other. It suggests a fracture healed by memory, a mistake, not a monster, an error, not a rebellion. And that's the difference. Where Marcion drew a line in the sand, the Gospel of Truth draws a circle inviting even the demiurge to remember. For the first 100 years after Jesus, there was no New Testament. No single leather-bound volume marked in red and gold. No definitive list of inspired texts. Christians, if they even called themselves that, yet shared letters, stories, hymns, and rumors. Some communities knew Paul's writings. Others clung to fragments of sayings. Some read Matthew or John. Others passed around the Gospel of Peter or of Mary or of truth. The boundaries were porous, the ink still wet, and then came the Codex. A mundane invention, really sheets folded into pages bound together like a modern book. Unlike the scroll which unraveled endlessly in one direction, the Codex allowed easy navigation, side-by-side comparison, and portability. It didn't just change how texts were read. It changed what was included. For the first time, Christians could begin to imagine not a gospel, but the gospel. Not a collection of voices, but a curated chorus. That shift was subtle at first, but it snowballed. Which gospels were worthy of being bound together? Which teachings were divine and which were dangerous? Which version of Jesus would survive when paper and ink became permanence? It wasn't settled overnight. The canon, our current New Testament, took centuries to crystallize. Even as late as the 4th century, church fathers still debated Revelation, Hebrews, and James. But one thing became clear early on: certain texts were going to be left out. Not because they were unreadable or even unpopular, but because they did not align. The Gospel of Truth, for example, never had a chance. Its poetic style, lack of historical narrative, and abstract theology placed it outside the rising orthodoxy. It didn't assert authority. It invited reflection. Worse, it didn't ground itself in apostolic witness. It floated intentionally untethered, like a dream remembered at dusk. Beautiful, inconvenient. The process of canonization was anything but neutral. It was shaped by politics, personality, and preservation. Texts quoted by influential bishops gained weight. Writings that reinforced emerging creeds were elevated. Those that complicated matters, especially ones with layered cosmologies or non-sacrificial Christologies, were pushed aside. Here's the obscure but vital detail: there was never a single moment when a council sat down and declared, "These 27 books and no others." The canon emerged from consensus, but it was the consensus of those who won. And winning often meant aligning with Rome. The tension this created can be felt even in the Gospels that did make the cut. Mark ends awkwardly. John includes mystical digressions. Paul's letters veer into metaphysics. Traces of alternate theologies still flicker beneath the surface echoes of the diversity that once flourished. But the Gospel of Truth and its kin, Thomas, Philip, Mary, Judas, posed a problem. They didn't just offer different details, they offered different frameworks. In them, Christ wasn't always crucified. Salvation wasn't always mediated. God wasn't always singular. These texts didn't fit, so they were deemed dangerous. And then they were hidden. Literally. Which brings us back to Nag Hammadi. Why bury books in jars? Why trek into the desert and seal sacred texts away like relics because danger had shifted from sword to scroll. To possess a banned gospel was to risk excommunication or worse. So someone likely a monk with divided loyalties preserved them. Not for rebellion, for remembrance. The callback is subtle but sharp. Earlier we watched Sophia reach too far and fall. Now we see the Church reaching inward, selecting, excluding, canonizing, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. To survive, Christianity needed coherence, and coherence required curation. This raises the open question, was the canon the product of divine guidance or historical contingency? Some argue that God worked through the councils and debates to preserve true doctrine. Others suggest the canon reflects the politics of its time, a mirror of imperial Christianity's ascent. Modern scholars walk this tightrope daily. There is admiration for the beauty of the New Testament and curiosity about what was left behind. The gospel of truth becomes a case study not of heresy but of exclusion. Its absence in the canon tells us more about the canon than it does about the gospel. Because in the end, to canonize is to declare limits. And the gospel of truth resists limits. It doesn't give you doctrine. It gives you metaphor. It doesn't explain. It evokes. That might be why it never stood a chance. Boundaries require borders, and this gospel drifts. What if salvation wasn't a matter of belief, but of passage? Not something granted at the moment of confession, but something unfolded slowly, ritually, through symbols, gestures, and whispered knowledge. In the shadowy corridors of early Christian history, there existed a multitude of communities who believed exactly that. They held rites. They performed baptisms not once but in stages. They passed on secret names, sacred formulas, and cosmological blueprints that mapped the soul's return to its source. And while the canonical Gospels spoke of bread and wine, these groups spoke of reunions between aeons and sparks of divine light finding their way home. The gospel of truth doesn't lay out a ritual handbook, but its language suggests something deeper than casual devotion. The text pulses with hints of initiation, phrases like those whose names he knew and those who have received knowledge. It draws a clear line between the sleeping and the awakened, and the tone is not one of public preaching, but of inner teaching. It is less sermon, more ceremony, less instruction, more invocation. Valentinian communities widely believed to have preserved and circulated the gospel of truth were known for their elaborate rites. Baptism was not merely symbolic. It was a portal, a multi-layered initiation into cosmic truths. Some records speak of 5 sacraments: baptism, chrism, Eucharist, redemption, and bridal chamber. The last of these in particular has baffled scholars for generations. The bridal chamber appears in texts like the Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi document, and is said to represent the soul's union with its divine counterpart. It was not a physical ceremony, though detractors certainly accused Gnostics of scandalous rituals, but a mystical reunion. Male and female, matter and spirit, lost and found. It was the capstone of spiritual ascent, the moment of remembering one's true name. Such rituals weren't held in basilicas or beneath painted domes. They were conducted in quiet, candlelit spaces, often in secrecy. Not because they were illegal, at least not yet, but because they were intimate, esoteric, meant only for the prepared. This secrecy was not elitism, it was reverence, like shielding a flame from the wind. The Orthodox Church, however, saw things differently. Salvation needed clarity, not metaphor, public sacraments, shared confessions, a unified ritual life. Anything less invited confusion. and so alternative rites were condemned as heretical or worse as theatrical manipulations of the gullible. Church fathers like Irenaeus accused the Valentinians of stagecraft, of dressing their initiates in bridal veils and performing symbolic acts that imitated the true sacraments. For them, mystery was not sacred. It was subversion, and yet even within Orthodox tradition, remnants of these rival rites remain. Early baptismal fonts often took the shape of tombs or wombs. Easter vigils were lit by flame sung in chants marked by white garments. The mystical never disappeared. It was simply reframed. There's an obscure detail in the Valentinian understanding of baptism worth noting. Unlike the canonical version, which emphasizes repentance and cleansing, their rite was about remembrance. Through it, the initiate was said to regain the knowledge of their origin. Baptism wasn't a washing. It was a waking. And this is where the gospel of truth offers its own subtle alignment. It speaks not of guilt and forgiveness, but of error and correction. Not of sacrifice, but of union. The soul once divided by forgetfulness is stitched back together through the voice of the one who came from the fullness. This voice does not condemn, it calls. Like a shepherd, not of sheep, but of sparks. There's also a curious callback here back to Sophia. Her descent, her fragmentation, her yearning to return, all of it echoes in these rites. The Valentinian initiate did not simply imitate Christ. They mirrored Sophia. They sought wholeness, integration, gnosis. Each ritual act was a reply to her original longing. Modern scholars remain divided. Were these secret rituals, literal ceremonies, symbolic meditations, elaborate myths? The texts are ambiguous, deliberately so. That ambiguity is part of their design, like dreams that mean different things in different lights. But one thing is clear for many early followers: faith wasn't passive. It was a path, a series of thresholds. The gospel of truth does not invite the reader to believe a doctrine. It beckons them across a veil. It doesn't ask for allegiance. It whispers, "Do you remember? And if you do, then come closer." She appears in every gospel, yet always at the edge. Not apostle, not enemy, not quite disciple. Mary Magdalene is the woman with 7 demons, the weeping mourner, the first witness to resurrection. And then she vanishes. Her voice, so close to the center, is never heard in full, at least not in the canonical texts. But elsewhere her gospel lingers, whispered, fragmented, hidden. And in it Christ speaks directly to her, not Peter, not John, not James, to her. The Gospel of Mary, another recovered text from the early centuries, places Mary not at the margins, but at the heart. In it, Jesus speaks to her privately after the resurrection. He entrusts her with knowledge the others did not receive. When she tells the apostles what he revealed, she is met with doubt. Peter challenges her authority. Levi defends her, and the group fractures. The question left hanging is never answered: what exactly did Jesus tell her? This gospel does not name its Christology overtly, but its tone mirrors that of the gospel of truth, calm, symbolic, elliptical. It doesn't emphasize sin or sacrifice. It speaks of inward journeys of the soul's ascent through hostile powers of peace found in recognition. Jesus does not command. He explains. He comforts. He reminds. Mary in this account is not merely a messenger. She is the receiver of revelation, the listener, the beloved, the one who understands. And perhaps that is precisely why her gospel was silenced. Because her prominence presents a profound challenge to the emerging church's structure, one built around apostolic succession, male hierarchy, and a tightly controlled narrative. If Mary had a separate teaching given by Jesus himself, and if that teaching emphasized inward knowledge over institutional authority, then everything wobbles. The pillars of orthodoxy tremble. The gospel of truth never names Mary. But its language, the emphasis on memory, the rejection of fear, the primacy of personal awakening, aligns with the voice she is given in her own gospel. There is a gentleness, a familiarity, a sense of having already known the truth long before it was spoken. One obscure but revealing moment in the Gospel of Mary occurs when she describes her soul's journey after death. She must pass through levels of opposition, powers, desires, wrath. These are not devils with pitchforks. They are psychological forces, attachments, illusions. Each asks her a question. Each must be answered with truth. Only then can she ascend. It's not a theology of punishment. It's a map of interior struggle. And that map curiously shares terrain with Valentinian thought, where the soul must remember its divine origin and overcome the ignorance that binds it to the material world. The echoes between the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Truth are faint but distinct, like two people humming the same melody from different rooms. The callback to Sophia again is unavoidable. A feminine figure who seeks knowledge, who is misunderstood, who falls or is silenced, and yet whose presence remains essential to the story's healing. Mary becomes in a way Sophia embodied not as cosmic principle, but as living person, a woman with a message that does not fit the structure. And the structure responded accordingly. Mary's gospel, like Thomas's, like truth, was excluded from the canon. Not refuted, not debunked, just omitted. She was remembered as a penitent, not a prophet, a follower, not a friend. The moment she tried to speak, the record faded to black. Modern scholars have resurrected her story with cautious reverence. Some suggest she was a teacher in her own right, leading a sect that followed a more mystical Christianity. Others argue that her prominence in apocryphal texts reflects a broader conflict in early Christian communities between those who valued hierarchy and those who valued revelation. Still others see her as a symbol, a cipher for the soul's inner feminine voice, the part of each person that receives and remembers. In this view, Mary isn't just a woman. She's an archetype, the listener who hears before others are ready. The seer who speaks what cannot be written. The gospel of truth, in its own quiet way, carries that same tone. It doesn't argue. It doesn't plead. It speaks as if the listener already knows. It trusts the inner voice. And in doing so, it creates a space where Mary might still be speaking. Not from pulpits, but in whispers. There is no Calvary in the gospel of truth, no crown of thorns, no nails, no final cry into the void. The cross, if it appears at all, is more symbol than spectacle, a tragic misunderstanding, not a sacred climax. In this telling, the death of Christ is not the point. The forgetting is. And the remembering, the return to knowledge, is the real salvation. This isn't an oversight. It's a choice. Where the canonical Gospels build their narrative toward the cross, like a slow ascent up a hill, the gospel of truth steps around it entirely. It doesn't dwell on physical suffering. It doesn't replay the agony. Instead, it floats above the blood and wood, pointing toward something more abstract, more internal. The Passion becomes less a historical event and more a metaphor for the soul's blindness, its habit of mistaking what is true for what is threatening. That absence is not neutral. It is revolutionary. For the early church, the crucifixion was everything. It fulfilled prophecy. It made sense of suffering. It drew a straight line between guilt and grace. Without the cross, orthodoxy's atonement model unravels. Sin cannot be paid for. Wrath cannot be satisfied. The temple curtain remains intact. But in the gospel of truth, these structures were never needed to begin with. Christ does not descend to die. He descends to reveal. And if he dies, it is not because God demands it. It is because the world cannot yet understand him. He is not a lamb led to slaughter. He is a light shining into eyes too long closed. One obscure passage in the text likens ignorance to terror fleeing truth, as though it were an enemy. The crucifixion in this view becomes the tragic endpoint of that panic. Not a sacrifice orchestrated in heaven, but a mistake repeated on earth. The world sees truth and recoils, not out of evil, out of fear. This framing aligns again with Valentinian theology, where salvation is not about forgiveness, but restoration. The soul is not stained, it is asleep. The act of waking requires no blood, only recognition. Of course, this idea was intolerable to the Church Fathers. A Christianity without the cross was like a kingdom without a throne. It undercut centuries of developing theology. It made sacraments look like pageantry. It turned Christ's mission into metaphor. And metaphor, unlike doctrine, is hard to enforce. This is where the callback becomes sharp. Earlier, we explored the Gospel's rejection of sacrifice as cosmic necessity. Here, that rejection is complete. The cross, once central, fades into background noise. It becomes a mirror reflecting our failure to see not God's plan to redeem. And that invites an open question. One scholars still debate, was the gospel of truth denying the crucifixion or simply refusing to elevate it? The text doesn't deny that Jesus died. It simply treats that death as a consequence, not a triumph, a sad punctuation mark on a sentence that began long before Golgotha. Some argue this downplaying of the cross was strategic, that the authors wished to shift attention from history to eternity, from the visible drama to the invisible truth. Others believe it was a form of resistance, a way to challenge the narrative being crystallized by those in power. Either way, the result is clear: this gospel does not find its hope in death. It finds it in knowledge, and that changes everything. It changes the role of the reader. No longer a sinner in need of pardon, you become a wanderer in need of memory. You are not guilty. You are lost. The Christ of this gospel doesn't offer you escape. He offers you a name you forgot. And in remembering that name, you begin to see the world not as it punishes, but as it truly is. The absence of the cross becomes its own kind of presence, a silent refusal, a theological protest, because perhaps the text implies the truest death was not Christ's, but ours. The death of knowing, the slow forgetting of where we came from. The cross then becomes not a site of redemption, but of confusion, a symbol of how truth, when misunderstood, is treated like a threat. And in that interpretation, the gospel of truth achieves something rare. It doesn't erase the crucifixion. It recontextualizes it. It transforms it from transaction into tragedy. Not because it failed, but because we weren't yet ready to recognize what stood before us. Beneath the surface of many rival gospels lies a quiet but astonishing idea that every human being carries a fragment of divine light, a shard, a spark, not metaphorically, but literally. You are in this view not merely made in God's image, but composed of God's substance. The problem isn't that you are sinful. The problem is that you've forgotten who you are. The gospel of truth doesn't spell this out with systematic precision, but its tone, its language, and its rhythm all point in this direction. When it describes the error of the world, it does so not with fire and judgment, but with sadness. When it speaks of Christ, it speaks not of a judge or a savior, but of a finder. He finds those who are lost. He gathers the scattered. He retrieves what was always his, and what he retrieves is us. This view comes directly from the Valentinian cosmology that likely shaped the gospel. In that framework, the divine realm called the pleroma was full of harmony until Sophia, in her desire to know the unknowable Father, caused a rupture. In that rupture, the material world was born governed by the demiurge. But in the process, tiny bits of divine essence were scattered into matter, into bodies, into the deep forgetting of creation. Those sparks are not symbolic. They are sacred. They are the reason Christ comes not to fix the world, but to rescue the fragments. And so Christ, in the gospel of truth, becomes the one who calls to what is already within you. He is not giving you something new. He is awakening something old. A kind of spiritual archaeologist brushing away layers of dust until your true name is revealed, not imposed, recalled. This turns salvation inside out. It's no longer something offered from outside, something you reach for or receive. It's something already present, like a melody you once knew but forgot how to hum. Christ doesn't carry you. He resonates with you. His voice stirs the same voice hidden in your bones. One particularly beautiful metaphor in the text compares error to a nightmare. The soul in ignorance dreams that it is being hunted, that it is lost, that it is in danger. But then someone comes to wake it, and the dream fades. The terror was never real. Only the forgetting made it feel true. This theology redefines the human condition. You are not condemned, you are confused. The world is not evil, it is asleep. And the gospel, rather than a manual for obedience, becomes a lullaby meant to stir you awake. This idea wasn't exclusive to the gospel of truth. It appears in other Gnostic texts as well. In the tripartite tractate, for instance, the soul is described as a stranger in a foreign land longing to return. In the Gospel of Philip's sacraments are described as the means by which light is recognized, not bestowed. And in the Apocryphon of John, the soul's journey through the archons is mapped out in exquisite detail, each stage a test of memory, not merit. All of it circles back to the fallen sparks. Divine essence trapped in material confusion. And the role of the Christ, the revealer, is not to redeem by blood, but to recover by voice. To find the parts of God that still wander in the world unaware of who they are. The callback to Sophia is obvious. Her error scattered the divine. Her yearning created the rupture. But her hope is not abandoned. It becomes the driving force behind the rescue. Her fragments are not punished. They are sought. And this too challenges the framework of orthodoxy. In traditional theology, salvation is vertical. God descends, humanity ascends. But in this vision, salvation is circular. The divine sends out pieces of itself and then regathers them not out of obligation, but out of love. It is a process of return, not reward. There's an open question still debated among scholars: were these fallen sparks considered human souls in general, or only a chosen few? Were all people carriers of light, or just the elect, the awakened ones? The gospel of truth remains ambiguous. It speaks of those whose names he knew before the foundation, suggesting a kind of spiritual predestination. But even that may be more poetic than literal. Perhaps the gospel is not drawing lines between saved and unsaved, but between those who remember and those who still dream. And that dream, the gospel insists, is thick with error. It makes you forget your origin. It makes you mistake yourself for flesh alone. It fills the world with fear and conflict and illusion. But none of that is real. The real thing is still inside you, waiting. The gospel of truth does not demand repentance. It invites recognition. It doesn't call for penance. It calls you by name. because it whispers the light in you was never lost, only hidden. There he is again, Judas Iscariot, the man whose name became a curse. In the canonical story, he's the betrayer, the one who sold the Son of God for 30 silver coins and sealed the deal with a kiss. But in a gospel that surfaced out of desert dust nearly 2 millennia later, Judas is not the villain. He is the only one who understands. He doesn't betray Christ. He obeys him. The Gospel of Judas came to light in the early 2000s, after a long and troubled journey involving looters, smugglers, and a nearly disintegrated papyrus. When it was finally restored and translated, what it revealed was nothing short of theological dynamite. In this version, Jesus laughs not out of joy, but irony. He mocks the other disciples for misunderstanding him, for worshiping a lesser God, for making offerings that amount to nothing. Only Judas Jesus says truly sees him, and it is Judas whom he entrusts with the task of freeing him from his physical shell. This isn't just a literary reversal, it's a metaphysical upheaval. The Jesus of this gospel isn't interested in fulfilling prophecy or redeeming sin. He wants out. He knows the material world is a trap, a creation of the demiurge, and that his mission is to escape, not sacrifice himself. Judas, in helping him die, doesn't betray him. He liberates him. It's jarring, it's unnerving, and yet, it's strangely consistent with the logic of the gospel of truth. Because if Christ didn't come to die as a sacrifice, but to awaken memory and release the divine from the material, then Judas's role becomes something else entirely. Not betrayal, but initiation, a necessary trigger to allow Christ's Spirit to return to the fullness. The betrayal in this reading is not moral, it is mystical. That shift invites a subtle callback to earlier moments in this tapestry of Gospels. Remember the Gospel of Thomas, where salvation comes through interpretation. Remember the Gospel of Mary, where secret knowledge is passed to the one least expected. And remember Sophia, whose error gives birth to a world she didn't mean to create, but whose restoration begins with acknowledgement, not punishment. Now Judas joins that pattern. He's not righteous, he's not evil, he's chosen. And that's the open question that still ripples through academic circles. Was the Gospel of Judas meant to be taken seriously as a piece of doctrine, or was it a satire aimed at mocking apostolic ignorance? Some scholars argue it's a Gnostic rebuke of early church leaders, those same disciples who misunderstood Jesus even while he stood in front of them. Others see it as a genuine alternative theology, where betrayal becomes obedience, and the path to salvation runs through paradox. The Gospel of Truth never directly mentions Judas, but it operates on the same wavelength, the same undermining of surface narrative in favor of deeper revelation. In both texts, the crucifixion is not divine punishment, but human miscomprehension, and in both the reader is invited to question not just what happened, but what it meant. The difference is tone. The Gospel of Truth sings softly. The Gospel of Judas cuts sharply. Truth offers you a hand. Judas offers you a dagger, one that perhaps was meant not to wound, but to open something. There's an obscure yet telling moment in the Gospel of Judas where Jesus says, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me. The body is a shell. The divine essence must be freed." Judas understands this while the others squabble over altars and offerings. And this concept that the body is clothing the spirit, the true self, flows back into the currents of the Gospel of Truth. There, the physical world is not evil but confused. The crucifixion is not necessary but inevitable. And the real salvation is not won through blood but through memory. Judas becomes then a mirror for the reader. Not a model, not a warning, a mystery. What if the truest act of faith is the one that looks like betrayal? What if the role everyone condemns is the one that needed to be played? What if Judas, like the reader, was being asked to see something no one else could? And what if, just if he said yes? There's a peculiar silence that follows a book being buried. Not the quiet of indifference, but the stillness of intentional forgetting. In the centuries after Christ's death, Christianity did not evolve smoothly. It fractured, it flared, it fought with itself, and eventually it chose. Certain voices were amplified, others were smothered, and the shift from gnosis to dogma, from spiritual memory to institutional creed, was sealed not by arguments alone, but by suppression. Quiet, strategic, forceful suppression. In the first 2 centuries, Christian thought was a kaleidoscope. Competing gospels circulated freely. Communities passed around teachings that emphasized mystical vision, inner awakening, and cosmological riddles. The gospel of truth existed in that fluid space, a voice among many speaking softly of remembrance, reunion, and the dissolution of error. It didn't scream to be heard, but it was heard, enough to be feared. As the church began to solidify its power first in theology, then in politics, it became increasingly concerned with stability. Unity required orthodoxy. Orthodoxy required boundaries, and boundaries meant certain ideas had to go. Gnostic writings, Valentinian reflections, poetic gospels that didn't toe the line, these became liabilities. The Roman Empire played a key role in accelerating this process. In the early 300s, Constantine embraced Christianity. What had once been a persecuted faith was now invited into the halls of power. But imperial favor came with a cost: internal coherence. An empire cannot function on divergent metaphysics. It needs clarity. Councils were convened. Heresies were named. Canonical lines were drawn with the ink of decree. One open question that lingers today is whether this suppression was deliberate eradication or unintentional entropy. Did bishops and emperors conspire to erase rival teachings, or did these gospels simply fade under the weight of political neglect, their scribes dying before their scrolls could be copied again? The truth likely lies in the middle. Some texts were explicitly condemned. Others were left to rot. Libraries burned not always with malice but with carelessness. And yet, some were hidden, not destroyed. Hidden. The gospel of truth was buried wrapped in leather, sealed in clay, and placed beneath desert sands. That was not erasure. That was preservation. A long game of waiting. This act of burial stands as its own kind of rebellion, a whisper of resistance against a rising orthodoxy that no longer tolerated riddles. The church needed certainty. The gospel of truth offered metaphor. The church demanded doctrine. The gospel invited memory. The church structured a hierarchy. The gospel spoke of direct awakening of names known before time. And so the gag order descended. Bishops like Irenaeus and Tertullian did their part cataloging heresies, denouncing teachings, branding Gnostic theology as elitist, heretical, even demonic. Their writings survive. The words they tried to bury did not, at least not above ground. The suppression wasn't just textual, it was sacramental. Gnostic initiations were replaced with universal baptism. Mystical unions gave way to liturgies. The open question became closed answer. The gospel moved from whispered wisdom to codified creed. Yet even in the canonical gospels, traces of the mystical remained. John's prologue still sings of the Word before time. Paul's letters still hint at cosmic mysteries. These were the compromise the surviving metaphors allowed to exist under new definitions. But the full flowering of gnosis, the direct experience of divine remembrance, was no longer welcome in the open air. The gospel of truth's disappearance mirrors this arc. It did not fail because it was wrong. It failed because it didn't play the game. It didn't assert authority. It didn't cite apostles. It didn't build fences. It built windows. And in a world moving toward institutional control, windows are dangerous. They let in too much light. The callback is clear. The divine spark, once scattered in Sophia's yearning, had to be gathered not just in people, but in texts. And so the Church, like a cosmic editor, collected its sparks and canonized them. Anything that didn't glow in the right frequency was discarded, no matter how beautiful. Modern scholars still debate whether this was inevitable. Was the institutionalization of Christianity a survival mechanism or a betrayal of its roots? Was Gnosis simply too fragile to compete with the demands of empire? But perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps Gnosis was never meant to compete. Perhaps it always knew it would be buried. Not because it failed, but because it would be found. And so the gospel of truth didn't end in flames. It ended in silence. Clay jars, desert heat, waiting. Until now. Before there were cathedrals, there were caves. Before dogma was carved into stone, stories were painted on plaster, fragile images flickering by oil lamplight in underground chambers. These were not grand statements of orthodoxy. They were quiet affirmations, symbols, shapes, a fish, a shepherd, a woman at a well. And somewhere between these lines, just maybe there are echoes of the Gospels that did not survive the councils, but did survive the centuries. Early Christian art, particularly in the Roman catacombs, is deliberately sparse. It avoids crucifixion scenes. It rarely shows suffering. Instead, it presents images of rest, of peace, of guidance. The Good Shepherd bearing a sheep. The orange figure arms raised in prayer. Jonah emerging from the fish. These were not literal illustrations. They were codes, signals, visual theology rendered in symbol rather than scripture. And here's where things get interesting. Some of these images, particularly from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, reflect ideas more closely aligned with the gospel of truth and its relatives than with later orthodoxy. The absence of the cross in early iconography mirrors its absence in the gospel of truth. Instead of emphasizing atonement, the art emphasizes resurrection, reunion, memory. Jesus is not depicted in torment, but as a guide, a teacher, a revealer. One fresco in the catacomb of Priscilla in Rome shows a woman arms outstretched in the orange pose. Around her scenes of biblical memory. Could this be an early depiction of Mary as prophet rather than penitent? Or Sophia personified? Scholars remain divided, but the symbolism is tantalizing. It suggests that early Christians may have held broader visions of authority, identity, and salvation than later theology permitted. Another curious motif, the image of the Anastasis Christ, lifting Adam and Eve from their tombs, surrounded by radiant light. This theme, common in Eastern iconography, visualizes Christ not as judge, but as liberator from the grave, rescuing the first humans, redeeming all history. It echoes the gospel of truth's emphasis on error being undone through recognition. Not punishment, not wrath, but awakening. There's also the use of light imagery, halos, rays, sunbursts, emphasizing not the suffering of Christ, but his luminosity, the light of knowledge, the spark of divine truth. This aligns more closely with Valentinian metaphysics than with the blood-drenched realism of medieval crucifixion scenes. The gospel of truth may not be quoted on any ancient wall, but its theology breathes in these early visuals in the quiet, in the indirect. Art, after all, was safer than text. Fewer accusations, more ambiguity. A way to preserve a vision without provoking a bishop. An obscure but significant detail in some early mosaics, Christ is shown without a beard, youthful, serene, almost androgynous. This image faded as church art standardized Jesus into the familiar, solemn figure. But the earlier version carries traces of a different Christ, one not nailed down by doctrine but fluid, almost dreamlike. The revealer, not the redeemer. Scholars continue to debate the meaning of these images. Were they theological statements, or simply the result of aesthetic preference and cultural influence? It's hard to say. Art resists precision, but in its very vagueness lies its strength. It holds space for ambiguity. It offers continuity with forgotten theologies. And so perhaps we find here another callback. If Christ's voice in the gospel of truth was a memory whispered through time, then early Christian art was the echo chamber absorbing that voice, reflecting it in shape and color, long after the text was hidden. A visual gnosis, a painted remembrance. There's a final irony in all of this. While bishops and emperors argued over creeds, artists kept painting. While gospels were condemned, symbols were carved into stone. The institution tried to control the word, but the image slipped through the cracks. And maybe that's the point. You can burn a book, you can ban a doctrine, but you cannot silence a symbol. It waits, it glows, it carries the spark, even in the dark. Buried with the gospel of truth in the Nag Hammadi library was a stranger, lonelier text, one that seemed to drift even further from the familiar roads of Christianity. The Gospel of the Egyptians, not to be confused with an earlier now lost work by the same name, stands as one of the most enigmatic of the apocryphal Gospels. It reads not like a biography or sermon, but like a liturgy of cosmic recursion, hymns, invocations, and layered metaphysics spiraling through silence and sound. The Gospel begins not with Christ, but with silence, literally. It names a state of existence called the invisible Spirit, from whom all things proceed. This isn't the God of Genesis speaking light into the void. This is a God before language, unknowable, unnamed, a fullness that begets not creation, but emanation. From that emanation come aeons paired beings, and ultimately a series of divine identities that include names like Barbelo, Yesius, Mazareus, and the Mother. It's not easy reading. The text is dense, looping, full of refrains, like the Father of the All, the Eternal Child, the Silence. But within its labyrinthine prose lies something unmistakably familiar, an insistence on divine unity fractured into multiplicity. It doesn't tell a story of fall and redemption. It tells a story of memory and return. Sound familiar? The Gospel of Truth offers its readers a poetic meditation on forgetfulness and awakening. The Gospel of the Egyptians offers a cosmological chant, rising out of silence, descending into creation, and spiraling back again. One uses metaphor, the other mantra, but both point toward the same central idea that salvation is not about behavior, it is about awareness. And here's where the two intersect most provocatively. Their Christ is not the teacher of parables or the martyr of Calvary. He is the revealer of structure, the one who shows the map, not just the way. In the Egyptian gospel, the Christ figure doesn't redeem the world. He reveals the design beneath it. He names the invisible. He describes the indescribable. He doesn't heal wounds. He reminds the soul what it was before it ever bled. One obscure but powerful passage contains a sequence of invocations where the speaker repeats I am statements in divine triads. These aren't just affirmations, they're identity exercises designed to awaken the reader into divine alignment. The goal is not belief, it is embodiment. This emphasis on divine identity aligns quietly but clearly with the gospel of truth's assertion that Christ came so that we might remember our name, not our moral status, not our doctrinal correctness. Our name, the essence of who we are before the world, clouded it with error. And that brings us to the gospel's most curious feature, its triple powers. The text speaks of a father, a mother, and a child, not as metaphors, but as eternal principles. This triadic pattern, echoed in other Valentinian writings, places the divine not into the legalistic structure of judge and savior, but into relational harmony. Unity expressed in diversity. A family of being, not a throne. For the Church, such formulations were deeply troubling. They introduced instability into the emerging doctrine of the Trinity. Worse, they introduced gender diversity into the Godhead. A divine mother, a paired creation. These ideas danced too far from the rigid frameworks being built in Nicene halls and bishopric councils. The response once again was exclusion. The gospel of the Egyptians was labeled heretical, obscure, irrelevant, and perhaps it is at least in its complexity. But its survival in the same codex as the gospel of truth suggests that these ideas were not random. They were curated, held together, copied not for curiosity, but for preservation. Scholars today continue to debate what this gospel means. Some see it as a mystical liturgy recited in secret by initiates. Others consider it an abstract theological exercise disconnected from practical worship. Still others see in it a map, a metaphysical chart of the soul's journey through emanation and back toward the fullness. But the common thread, once again, is memory. Not moral reform, not creed recitation. Memory. The callback to earlier motifs is undeniable. Sophia's yearning, the demiurge's mistake, the scattered sparks, the bridal chamber, all of it finds resonance here, though, in stranger terms. The gospel of the Egyptians doesn't so much tell the story again as sing it in a different key. Its Christ does not preach from mountains. He reverberates through aeons. And its message is not believe, it is be. The fact that this gospel survived at all is remarkable. That it was sealed beside more readable texts is perhaps a final whisper from those early mystics. Not every truth fits into a sentence. Some must be chanted, some must be buried, and some, when unearthed, speak not to the mind, but to the memory beneath it. It speaks of kisses, unions, and names unspoken. The Gospel of Philip, another enigmatic jewel from the Nag Hammadi library, is less a gospel in the narrative sense, and more a patchwork of mystical aphorisms, ritual language, and theological fragments. But among these pieces, glimmering and strange, is a vision of Christ that deepens the path laid out by the gospel of truth. Here, salvation is not given, it is remembered, and it is not achieved alone. Unlike the gospel of truth, which rarely speaks of historical characters or earthly moments, the gospel of Philip is startlingly intimate. It references Jesus by name. It speaks of Mary Magdalene not as penitent sinner or distant observer, but as someone deeply, spiritually close to him. The companion of the Savior, it says, is Mary Magdalene. He loved her more than all the disciples, and he kissed her often on the missing word has long haunted scholars. Cheek, lips, forehead. The damage to the manuscript has only deepened the mystery and the controversy. But the real tension doesn't lie in where the kiss landed. It lies in what the kiss meant. The text explains that the kiss was a symbol of imparting gnosis, spiritual knowledge. It wasn't romantic in the modern sense. It was a transmission, an awakening, a mystical fusion between those who remember and those who reveal. This union, symbolized again and again in the Gospel, is described not as carnal but as sacred. The idea of the bridal chamber dominates the text. a symbolic space or perhaps a literal right, where the soul is joined to its angelic counterpart, where wholeness is restored through union, where what was scattered is brought back together. Here Christ is not the crucified atoner, he is the bridegroom. Not in the eschatological sense of wedding the church at the end of time, but as the one who awakens the soul to its hidden pair. It is a deeply erotic gospel, but the eros here is not fleshly. It is cosmic, a longing not for bodies, but for completeness. And that again echoes the gospel of truth. In both, salvation is framed as restoration, not forgiveness, reunion, not ransom. The Christ of Philip is the mirror and the match. He reminds you not only who you are, but who you were always meant to become. One obscure passage reads, "Truth did not come into the world naked, but in types and images." That phrase could just as easily be a footnote to the gospel of truth itself, which cloaks its deepest meanings in metaphor. Philip takes the same approach, but shifts the lens toward the body, toward embodiment, ritual, physical echoes of spiritual truths. The Eucharist, for instance, is not just remembrance. It is a mystery. The cup of prayer contains wine. It is full of the Holy Spirit, and it belongs to the perfect human. Again, the emphasis isn't on sin and redemption, but on awakening and transformation. The sacraments aren't ceremonies. They're activations. The gospel also plays with the idea of names, true names. In one passage, it suggests that naming something brings it into being, but only the one who knows the Father's true name can truly speak it. This notion of hidden identity, accessible only through gnosis, loops back to the gospel of truth's frequent evocations of memory, forgetfulness, and rediscovery. You are not told who you are. You are shown. You are reminded. There's an undercurrent of ritualism here that sets Philip apart. It seems to refer to a living community, a group of initiates, who practiced these ceremonies possibly in secret. It speaks of anointing of resurrection happening now, not later. People say that they will die first and then rise, but they must receive resurrection while they live. This is not metaphor, it's liturgy. And that raises the open question: were these communities merely fringe sects lost to time, or were they once widespread, only later pushed to the margins? The Gospel of Philip has no interest in answering that. It simply is a voice among many, a song from a now silent room. The callback to earlier motifs is subtle but poignant. If the gospel of truth whispers that Christ comes to awaken memory, Philip suggests he comes to complete the reunion. The two texts together paint salvation as both inward and shared, personal and partnered. Truth begins the remembering. Philip completes the return. But for the institutional church, this was too dangerous, too suggestive, too egalitarian. The idea that salvation could be accessed through direct experience, through intimate union, through secret names and unsanctioned rites, this undercut the entire emerging structure. And so Philip, like truth, was buried. But the imagery lingers. A kiss, a name, a chamber filled with light. Not dogma, but memory. By now the pattern is unmistakable. The gospel of truth wasn't alone. It wasn't a rogue document drifting through the 2nd century like theological flotsam. It was part of a broad, complex, and often poetic ecosystem of belief, a rival Christianity, if not in name then in tone. It offered a version of Christ that did not demand blood, did not elevate authority, did not threaten punishment. And that made it dangerous. But not because it was wrong, because it was beautiful. The gospel of truth had to be silenced, not because it lacked coherence, but because it refused control. It did not ask you to follow rules. It invited you to remember. It didn't offer formulas, it offered metaphors. It was in every sense a challenge to what the Church was becoming: a fortress of doctrine, a system of sacraments, a gatekeeper of salvation. In the gospel of truth, God is not wrathful. He is forgetful of our errors because our errors stem from ignorance, not rebellion. Christ is not a bloodied ransom, but a whisper from the fullness, sent to awaken those who belong to the light. The cross is not the hinge of history. It is the tragic evidence of misunderstanding. And if that is the case, then why build cathedrals at all? One can imagine the discomfort this must have caused, as the Church evolved from scattered house gatherings into a central institution. As bishops became public figures, as emperors began to lean toward Christian endorsement, there needed to be structure, certainty, uniformity. The theological sprawl of the 2nd century had to be paved over, and texts like the Gospel of Truth, ambiguous, lyrical, resistant to hierarchy, stood in the way. The Gospel's metaphors make this clear. It speaks of names written in the heart of a Father who is known not through prophecy, but through recollection. It praises those who recognize themselves, who awaken from error, as if shaking off a bad dream. No obedience, no creed recitation, just a moment of sudden clarity and peace. This message doesn't require a priest, and that is precisely the problem. Because institutions do not thrive on internal awakening. They thrive on participation, on declarations, on clearly marked borders. A gospel that tells you the kingdom is already within you doesn't leave much room for intermediaries. An obscure passage near the middle of the text says, "Those who have it know that they are from the light." Not will know, not hope. Know. It implies an inner certainty that cannot be taught, only remembered. And what does that make of bishops and creeds and excommunications unnecessary? And so the gospel of truth was buried not just physically, but conceptually. It was erased from liturgies, omitted from councils, denied citation. Until the 20th century, no one had read it in over 2,500 years. When it was finally unearthed, it felt not like a revelation, but like an interruption, an ancient voice asking gently, "Why did you forget? This is the callback that binds it all." From Sophia's fall to Judas's vision from the bridal chamber, to the spark within this entire constellation of rival gospels offered a coherent alternative, that truth is not delivered from above, but drawn out from within. That Christ is not the founder of a religion, but the finder of the lost. And that salvation is not a reward. It is a return. No wonder it had to go. But the open question remains, was its erasure complete, or did traces survive? Modern Christianity, even in its most orthodox forms, still contains echoes. The idea that God is love, that Jesus is the light, that there is no fear in perfect understanding. These could all be read as distant descendants of the gospel of truth, diluted and reframed. And there are readers, quiet readers, who feel something when they encounter this gospel, a familiarity, a shiver. Not because it's new, but because it isn't. The silence imposed on it was not total. It was just long. And perhaps now we are ready to hear it again. The gospel of truth ends the way it lives, without conclusion, without command, without a neat moral ribbon to tie it all together. There is no great commission, no apocalyptic prophecy, no final trial or final judgment. Instead, the text fades like breath on a mirror, leaving behind a gentle condensation of metaphor. A memory you can't quite name but can't stop feeling. Its last lines speak of rest, of unity, of silence becoming speech, and speech returning to silence. It is less like a farewell, and more like a door closing quietly behind you after you've stepped inside something vast. There is no amen, no go and make disciples. The ending is more exhale than epilogue. That too is deliberate. Unlike canonical gospels that crescendo into resurrection and ascension, the gospel of truth floats downward into stillness. It is not concerned with proving anything. It does not defend its ideas. It does not challenge dissent. It simply speaks as though to those who already halfway remember, who only need a nudge to come home. And that raises the most tantalizing question of all: was it even finished? Some scholars argue that the ending, as we have it, is incomplete, that the original manuscript was damaged, and that its true conclusion is lost. Others propose that this ambiguity is the point, that the absence of finality mirrors the message itself. Truth is not a destination. It is a return, not a doctrine, a recognition. In one of its final passages, the text likens the soul's return to the moment when someone who is ignorant of himself awakens and remembers where he came from. There is no drama in this return, no trial, no throne, just the quiet lifting of a veil. The callback here is deeply intentional. Throughout the gospel, awakening has been the central act. Christ doesn't intervene violently. He doesn't rescue the unworthy. He doesn't plead or punish. He speaks. And those who hear, remember. And when they do, the world does not change. They do. That framework, salvation as interior shift rather than exterior redemption, remains one of the gospel of truth's most radical and enduring gifts. It implies that God has not been waiting to judge you. He's been waiting for you to remember him, not as ruler, but as origin, not as Lord, but as fullness. And once you do, the need for books, even this one, disappears. That may be why the ending feels like it trails off into open space. Because if truth has been remembered, then the text no longer needs to speak. But still, a final whisper lingers. It's in the syntax, in the rhythm, in the repetition of light returning to light. Word to word, name to name. Christ is not the end of the sentence. He's the space between syllables. He is not the goal. He is the grammar of being. Modern readers sometimes expect more. They want narrative closure, a satisfying punch. But this gospel offers none of that. It doesn't resolve tension, it dissolves it. You are not left wondering what happens next. You are left wondering what has always been. That's the riddle. Not what you must do, but what you already are. There's a subtle irony in all of this. After centuries of suppression, after institutional condemnation and burial in desert jars, the gospel of truth still refuses to argue for itself. It doesn't vindicate. It doesn't accuse. It simply ends. Or perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps it pauses, waiting like a memory to be remembered. And perhaps, if you're quiet enough, it will finish itself in you. Imagine the early centuries of Christianity not as a straight road, but as a labyrinth. Paths looped, split, doubled back on themselves. Some led to grand temples of doctrine, others dead-ended in forgotten caves. In that maze, dozens, perhaps hundreds of gospels once circulated, some written in Greek, others in Coptic Syriac or Aramaic, some known only by name, others by a single quoted line in a hostile refutation. Many are gone, but not all. The gospel of truth is one surviving ember. Its peculiar metaphors and gentle heresies are echoes of a much larger, stranger conversation. A conversation we were never supposed to hear. What happens when we map these fragments together? The lines begin to converge. Start with Valentinus and his followers. The gospel of truth, the gospel of Philip, parts of the tripartite tractate, each reflects a vision of Christ, not as rescuer, but revealer. He enters not to bleed, but to awaken. He does not erase sin, because sin in this schema is ignorance. He does not suffer punishment, because he is beyond the reach of the demiurge's petty laws. Instead, he speaks, and in speaking, restores. This connects seamlessly with the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus offers no narrative, no miracles, only sayings like Zen koans, designed to jolt the listener into awareness. Line 1. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death, a promise not of reward, but of recognition. Follow that thread, and you find the Gospel of Mary. Here, too, Christ is a revealer. He departs, but leaves behind secret knowledge not to Peter or John, but to Mary Magdalene. The text's core is missing, torn from the manuscript, but what remains pulses with something uncanny. A conflict, a tension, a memory of a teaching no longer welcome. Then there is the Gospel of Judas, a late venomous flower in the Gnostic garden. Here Jesus laughs at his disciples, not cruelly, but knowingly. They worship the wrong God, the text implies. Only Judas sees truly. Only Judas understands. His betrayal is obedience to a higher command. Sacrifice becomes strategy. Christ needs a door out of the illusion. Judas provides it. These Gospels are not siblings, but distant cousins. They differ wildly in tone, content, and cosmology. Some speak in riddles, others in visions. One describes aeons and emanations, another silence and stillness. Yet across them a pattern emerges. Jesus in these texts is not a martyr. He is not an atoning lamb. He is a mirror held up to the soul. And knowledge, secret, inward, destabilizing, is the path to salvation. That is what made them dangerous. Not just to bishops and emperors, but to the idea of orthodoxy itself. If you need no priest to forgive you, no altar to redeem you, if the divine spark is already within you, then what is the role of the Church? What becomes of sacraments, of hierarchy, of sacred tradition? The gospel of truth never attacks the Church, but it renders it irrelevant. And so, like many of its kin, it was buried. Codices were burned, scrolls hidden, names anathematized. The canon closed, and what lay outside became heresy by definition. But history, like truth, has a stubborn tendency to resurface. From Oxyrhynchus to Nag Hammadi, from monasteries in Syria to caves in Upper Egypt, pages keep reappearing. Sometimes intact, sometimes only fragments. A line here, a name there. Like pieces of a shattered mirror that once reflected a face no one was meant to see. And if we could reassemble it, what then would the Christ who emerges look familiar? Or would he too speak in riddles? Would he still call himself the way and the truth, but leave the word life hanging like a whisper? Would he demand belief or just attention? The map of missing Gospels does not lead to one answer. It leads to many. And perhaps that was always the point. Not to replace one orthodoxy with another, not to trade popes for prophets, but to reopen a question that never truly closed. Who was Jesus not to the councils, not to the cathedrals, but to those who dreamed of him in the quiet? So here we are. You followed the whispers, the fragments, the Gospels half remembered and half buried. You've wandered through a garden of vanished voices, Valentinus, Philip, Mary, Judas, and held up the gospel of truth like a shard of stained glass. And now, as the last of the candlelight flickers, a question lingers in the hush. What if they were right, not all of them, of course? The Gnostic texts contradict each other as much as they oppose orthodoxy. One sees the world as a trap, another as a puzzle. One paints Christ as luminous and beyond touch. Another imagines him laughing, hidden in plain sight. But through their scattered metaphors, a single thread hums softly beneath the noise. Maybe Jesus came not to die but to awaken. Maybe sin isn't disobedience but forgetfulness. Maybe salvation isn't offered, it's remembered. It's tempting to dismiss these ideas as poetic relics, curious, even beautiful, but not true. After all, didn't history already decide? Didn't the councils vote, the creeds form, the canon settle? Isn't that what makes us certain? And yet certainty is a brittle thing. The gospel of truth doesn't scream rebellion. It murmurs it, gently. It replaces wrath with recognition and judgment with joy. It tells you you are not fallen, you are forgetful, you don't need to be forgiven, you need to remember, that's all. Would you believe that, could you? Or would it feel too soft, too open-ended, too strange? But maybe truth was never supposed to fit inside the spine of a single book. Maybe it isn't carved in marble, but written in sand, and the tide comes and goes. In the quiet hours of the night when doctrine fades and doubt creeps in, not as fear, but as wonder, maybe you find yourself wondering not what you've been told, but what you've forgotten. So just for tonight, let the official stories sleep. Let the councils rest in their tombs of parchment and incense. Let the bishops argue in the dark, and listen. Not for commandments, not for creeds, but for the whisper of a forgotten gospel. A voice that says, you are not lost, you are asleep, and now you are waking.